Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. It's often remarked, with a tone of astonishment, that the Commonwealth Constitution does not mention the Prime Minister, or indeed the Cabinet. Now that's true in the literal sense, but it doesn't give the whole picture. So let's explore it a little bit more. First, the Constitution does mention ministers, and the Prime Minister, of course, is just one of a number of ministers. So in practice, the Prime Minister is mentioned in the Constitution, but just not using that very specific title. The title, Prime Minister, means First Minister, and he or she is supposed to be first among equals, or in Latin, primus inter pares. These days, we think of the title Prime Minister as a fixed kind of title, but it doesn't really have that kind of a history. In the past, the word Prime Minister was used interchangeably with a lot of other terms such as Premier or First Minister or Chief Minister. It was only in the 20th century in Australia that the use of terminology solidified, with the term Prime Minister being used for the leader of government at the Commonwealth level, Premier being used at the state level, and Chief Minister being used at the territory level. Because these titles are now strongly identified with different levels of government in Australia, we tend to forget that there was that greater fluidity in their use in earlier times. For example, if you read dispatches from the British government to the Australian state governors in the early 20th century, they'll often discuss the governor's relationship with his Prime Minister, because that term was just commonly used as a descriptive term rather than a formal title. In the United Kingdom, the official title for the Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. Historically, the term Prime Minister began as a term of abuse. It was an accusation that one of the monarch's ministers had abused or exceeded their role by rising above that of other ministers with whom they were supposed to be equal. When Robert Harley, the Earl of Oxford, was impeached in 1715, one of the charges against him was that he acted as a Prime Minister. In practice, because the First Lord of the Treasury had significant financial powers, this minister came to be regarded as the leader of the government, and the term Prime Minister became a colloquial description for that person, while First Lord of the Treasury continued to be the formal title. Robert Walpole is usually regarded as being the first British Prime Minister, as we understand that term today. Nonetheless, he apparently, according to someone's memoirs anyway, told the House of Commons in 1741, "I unequivocally deny that I am sole and Prime Minister." The term Prime Minister did not actually come into popular usage in the United Kingdom until the early 1800s. The list of ministers, as set out in the Hansard Record of Parliamentary Debates, didn't refer to the Prime Minister as such until 1885, and the predecessor of the Civil Service Yearbook in the United Kingdom didn't refer to the Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury until 1904. There was no mention of a Prime Minister in a British statute until 1917, in the statute that dealt with the grant of the Chequers estate for the use of the Prime Minister. The brass plate on the door of number 10 Downing Street actually says First Lord of the Treasury, not Prime Minister. Now, a short digression here. I first visited Downing Street as a child when it was an ordinary street and anyone could walk down it and have their photo taken there in front of the policeman. Now, in this particular photo, I'm the one in the middle, and unfortunately my head is obscuring that brass nameplate on the front door. Since then, terrorism has resulted in the street being closed off to the public, and a great security rigmarole before you can actually get to the door these days. A decade or so ago, I went to number 10 Downing Street for a meeting and a bit of a snoop around. And after going through security at the end of the street, in the drizzling rain, I headed towards the famous door. There was a red carpet in front of it because a head of state was about to arrive shortly, and there was a large press pack of soggy journalists and cameramen waiting across from the door, filming it. As I approached the door, there was no police officer outside to open it for me. Now, I assumed that someone inside would see me on CCTV and just open it, but no one did. Now, the rather bizarre thing about the door of number 10 Downing Street is that it has no door handle to open it from the outside, and it doesn't even have a keyhole. In fact, it can't be opened from the outside, only by someone on the inside. And it also opens from the wrong side, which you don't really expect. So I tried pushing at the door, but nothing happened. And as I stood there dripping on the doorstep with some sniggering journos behind me, thinking that I was too insignificant to get in the door, they might have been right, a civil servant charged down the street and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, just bang on the door," which she then did, and to my relief, the door opened. So that's my encounter with the front door of the First Lord of the Treasury. The title First Lord of the Treasury has never been used in Australia. In the Australian colonies, the leader of the government was often described as the Colonial Secretary or the Chief Secretary. Occasionally, the title Prime Minister was used in New South Wales around the 1870s in relation to the governments of Sir James Martin and James Farnell. The title Premier came to be used with respect to the states after Federation in 1901, but in New South Wales it was still not a formal ministerial portfolio until 1920, and again it was 1920 when it was first mentioned in the state constitution. At the federal level, the very first ministry, appointed by Lord Hopetoun as Governor-General and sworn in on the 1st of January 1901, included Edmund Barton as Prime Minister. But you can see from this celebratory card that Barton was there described as Premier of the Commonwealth, so the use of the term was still not completely settled. Geoffrey Saw explained that the office of Prime Minister had no legal existence and there was no Prime Minister's department. Mr. Barton, he said, was called Prime Minister by courtesy and convention. His only office was as Minister of External Affairs. Now you can see that in this first Commonwealth Government Gazette. It sets out the list of persons sworn as executive councillors, which is headed by Barton. Critically, it says Edmund Barton underneath the words "by His Excellency's command." And that means that Edmund Barton countersigned the appointments, showing that he was the minister who accepted responsibility for them. By convention, that means that he was the Prime Minister, being the person who had been asked to form a government and who had then advised the Governor-General about the appointments to that government. When it came to appointing ministers, Barton was formally appointed as the Minister to administer the Department of External Affairs. There was no formal appointment as Prime Minister, as there was no Department of State of that name to administer. In 1913, Andrew Fisher was formally appointed by the Governor-General to administer the Prime Minister's Department, putting the title of Prime Minister on a more formal legal footing. People often say that the Prime Minister runs the country, but that's actually not true. First, no single individual could possibly run the country in a meaningful way. Second, Australia is a federation. Most domestic matters fall within the jurisdiction of the states, such as hospitals and schools and roads and public transport and police and prisons and land usage. While the Commonwealth intervenes in such matters, particularly through the use of its money, it doesn't substantially run or control those matters. Third, major policy decisions that do fall within Commonwealth jurisdiction are made collectively through cabinet decisions. The extent of the Prime Minister's power will depend upon his or her capacity to influence and control the cabinet. Finally, most legal powers are conferred upon ministers by statute. If you look at the statutes that can be administered by the Prime Minister, as set out in the Administrative Arrangements Order, there's actually not much there. The Prime Minister has no legal power to override ministers and exercise the statutory powers that are conferred upon those ministers. A good illustration of this is the Morrison government's multiple ministry controversy. The reason the then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, felt he needed to get appointed to administer the departments of Health, Finance, Treasury, Home Affairs and Industry, Science, Energy and Resources was that he otherwise had no legal power to make decisions under legislation that falls within those portfolios, and he presumably did not think that he had sufficient political influence over his ministers and cabinet to effect that control. Nor did he seem to sufficiently trust most of his ministers to tell them of his actions. One day I'll do a video on that incident because it actually is quite interesting. Prime Ministers do have, by convention, significant political power because they can advise the Governor-General to appoint and remove ministers, and they can advise the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament and hold an election. They can also determine who gets on Cabinet committees and what gets on the Cabinet agenda, and they can also sum up the collective outcome of Cabinet decisions. But a Prime Minister's political power depends on whether his or her party colleagues continue to trust and support their leader. Political power is easily lost and cannot always be asserted. Now, back to the Constitution. Section 64 provides that the Governor-General may appoint officers to administer such departments of state of the Commonwealth as the Governor-General in Council may establish. This means that the Governor-General can appoint a Prime Minister to administer, for example, the department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, along with any other specified department. Section 65 also says that ministers shall hold such offices as the Parliament prescribes, or, in the absence of provision, as the Governor-General directs. And in practice, it is the Governor-General who directs which offices ministers hold. Section 62 also provides for the Governor-General to choose and summon members of the Federal Executive Council. Now, this is the body that provides formal advice to the Governor-General to exercise his or her legal powers, such as by making regulations or proclamations or making appointments to statutory officers. In practice, ministers are members of the Federal Executive Council, and usually about 2 of them are rostered on to meet with the Governor-General to provide that formal advice at every meeting of the Federal Executive Council. The advice reflects decisions of the responsible minister or the Cabinet. Now, this photo is of members of the Federal Executive Council who met to witness the Governor-General's proclamation of King Charles III as King of Australia. And that'll excite a few people. Note the one minister who didn't actually get the memo about us all having to be sombre on the occasion and not smile. Cabinet is not mentioned in the Constitution because it's a political body. It has no legal powers of its own. All the outcomes of Cabinet decisions are given effect by the legal powers of others, such as the statutory powers of ministers or powers conferred upon public servants, or the enactment of legislation by Parliament, or by the advice given to the Governor-General by the Federal Executive Council. The Constitution only deals with the legal side of things and leaves that political side to be managed by convention so that it's sufficiently flexible to be able to change over time. Now, I did do another video some time ago now about the difference between the Cabinet and the Federal Executive Council, for those of you who want to know more. So, yes, the Constitution doesn't mention the Prime Minister by title, but it does refer to ministers, which include the Prime Minister, and it provides specifically for their appointment. The Constitution does not mention the Cabinet either, but it does refer to the Federal Executive Council, which formally advises the Governor-General to act in accordance with decisions by Cabinet. The Constitution also mentions the ministers who comprise the Cabinet. The Constitution does, therefore, in general terms, cover the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, but not in a prescriptive way, as this was not the custom in countries with Westminster systems of government. As Edmund Barton explained at the Constitutional Convention in 1897, if the draft Constitution were to be altered to specify in detail how the system of, as he described it, cabinet government worked, he said the British Parliament would tell us that we did not know how to draft a constitution because we did not have sufficient constitutional knowledge. As a matter of pride, it was accepted that everyone knew about prime ministers and cabinet and how they operated in the Westminster system, and that specifying this in the Constitution would make Australians look rather foolish. To understand the Constitution, you need to do more than just read the words on the page. You need to understand that history. You need to understand convention and constitutional principles, and even constitutional jurisprudence, which was an assumed basis for a lot of the Constitution. You need to understand all of this to get the full picture. So it's not quite as simple as some internet pundits seem to think, but that is why you have a constitutional clarion to enlighten you. So I hope you do feel more enlightened from having watched this video, and I look forward to seeing you again next time for more enlightenment. Goodbye.